When making the caster marksman video way back in 2021, I talked about how it's almost impossible for Riot to make another caster marksman in League due to the inevitable risk of overlap the champion in question will have with other ability-based classes, namely the mage archetype. For the most part, Ezreal, Corki, and Lucian were about as far as you can go before things started to get really difficult. Just about every caster-based marksman from then on has run into extreme turbulence not too long after being released, forcing Riot to overhaul them aggressively, and by overhaul I mean nerf to the ground just to keep them in line. Many would argue Samira and Zeri were more problematic than a specimen for today, but having already made a video on Zeri a long while back, for recency's sake, let's talk about Smolder today. Though he's only been around for roughly half a year, Smolder wasted no time being a consummate stable presence in not just one, but 3 roles identical to what Zeri did back in her heyday, much to everyone's dismay. It's not necessarily against the rules for someone to be flexed into more than one role, but Zeri and now Smolder are special cases for reasons I'll cover in this video. When Smolder first came out, I was initially feeling pretty good about his design because I felt like Riot took the necessary steps to keep him from being too overpowered, and I stand by that. I think he has a fair amount of counterplay. But in light of how events have transpired throughout Season 14, I think the problem doesn't lie in the idea itself, rather the execution of the idea, explaining why a number of players take issue with the twerp in his current condition. So without further ado, let's talk about everything wrong with Smolder. Being a baby, Smolder's mom probably lectures him to eat a lot so he can grow big and strong. Well, that would be pretty easy if you had today's sponsor, Factor 75. They're back to grace their platters once again. For the 2.5 of you who don't know what Factor is, 1, you're missing out, and 2, Factor's a meal prep service that delivers handmade meals right to your door. You can get chef-prepared meals on the table in 2 minutes or less, ranging from a variety of options in a variety of quantities. They have a constantly updating menu of over 35 options per week with more than 60 possible add-ons like breakfast choices, on-the-go lunches, snacks and beverages to cover you morning, noon, and night. You can also customize your number of deliveries too, from anywhere between 4 to 18 meals per week, and if at any point you need to skip a week, you can pause and reschedule deliveries anytime. If you're concerned about sustainability from all the one-use packaging, don't worry, Factor offsets all of their delivery emissions and sources 100% renewable electricity for their production sites and offices. So rest assured, they're one of the most environmentally conscious meal prep services you can find. They're giving me a really good deal this time. By scanning the QR code on screen, you get 50% off your first box and 20% off the next month. This is actually good timing for me because I'm starting my bulking season right now, so be sure to take advantage of this while you can as well. But for now, let's get back to Smolder. Briefly recapping the premise of the caster marksman video, although I do recommend you watch it in full just to get some additional context and also, to support the channel, appreciate it. What separates a marksman from a mage is not what they do, but how they do it. Obviously, both classes are predicated on dealing damage. The difference is that marksmen primarily do so through auto attacks while mages do so through abilities. In other words, a caster marksman is effectively a physical mage, which already skirts a very fine line in terms of what they should be allowed to get away with. The line can get blurred extremely easily when you take this approach. For example, would lethality Q Vars be a marksman or an artillery mage? He could be either, he could be both. Whatever the case, why this matters is that it ties back to the notion of class preconception. When looking at a tank champion like Ornn, Malphite, or Nautilus, you have an idea of what they're expected to do, and thus you can formulate a plan of attack against them. So when you run into a beefy slow tank who can suddenly become hypermobile and shred you to pieces, that disconnect can be very jarring and cause a lot of frustration, which K'Sante most certainly has done to all of us multiple times. For the record, I'm not insinuating every champion has to adhere to a rigid set of boundaries, but it still has to be within reason, and that's why caster marksmen can be so tricky to deal with. For all the bullshit K'Sante has, at least you can still rest easy knowing he's exclusively a top laner, and the usual means to shut down other tanks can also shut down him. What are the expectations of a marksman? For one, we know they're capable of extraordinary damage output in both scale and consistency. We also know that marksmen are squishy and lack the necessary stats or abilities to fight on their own, especially in the early game, requiring them to be with the support to either set up their kills or protect them from enemy pressure. Because of this, few marksmen, if any, are found in solo lanes where self-sufficiency is of paramount importance. They don't have the base stats to really take on most top laners, nor do they have the range or area control of mages or the speed and burst potential of assassins in mid lane. Prevailing wisdom understands marksmen are among the most dangerous opponents to leave unchecked in the late game. Therefore, it stands to reason the most opportune time to shut them down is during laning phase when they're at their most vulnerable. This applies to the vast majority of ADCs, but that's why it makes champs like Lucian top and mid, Tristana top and mid, Zeri top and mid, and now Smolder top and mid such a problem. At first glance, Smolder appears to have all the same weaknesses of his peers. He's extremely easy for most champions to 1v1 in the early game, and honestly even later on. He has almost no semblance of utility in his kit, and he doesn't really do much damage. Most people can make quick work of him if he doesn't have a babysitter. Literally, he's a baby. But since he's a caster marksman, more specifically an evolving infinite scaling caster marksman, being playable in solo lanes only further underscores the challenge of trying to keep him in check. I know what you're gonna say, Smolder's win rate has been like 46% for the past few months and his solo lane win rate is worse than bot lane. I think we've established a long time ago that win rate means absolutely nothing in this game. But to humor you for a moment, yes, Smolder has a bad win rate. My counterpoint to that is that he's a classic case of popular champion syndrome and pro play champion syndrome. When a champion becomes too accessible or too popular, a bunch of idiots are gonna first time the champion in solo queue when they get autofilled, or when they want to for fun after 5 games and lose this queue. Then of course Riot over nerfing a champion because of their presence in pro play. Yeah, no, the champ's gonna have a low win rate. Smolder's main method of attack is naturally not within his autos. Like Ezreal and Zeri, he's more of a Q spammer, only in his case, his Q has many distinct perks to it. First and foremost is a point-and-click ability with the same attack range as him. This prevents him from playing the role of a backline long-range attacker like Ezreal or try to play just outside of attack range like Zeri, but in exchange, Super Scorcher Breath makes up for it by dealing AoE damage and applying on-hit effects to all enemies that collide with it. Not just that, but at 125 stacks, the effective range of this attack increases to over 1000 courtesy of the splash attacks that come after, which also apply on-hit effects. While Ezreal and Zeri can only really focus their main pressure on one target, Smolder can theoretically damage the entire enemy team with a single cast of Q, making him one of the best teamfight marksmen in the game at his higher stacks. Speaking of higher stacks, the more stacks you have, the bigger his Q becomes, and eventually the more deadly it becomes, not only dealing bonus damage based on the number of stacks, but also the mini Elder Dragon buff he gets. Numbers wise, it's not quite as game warping as the actual Elder Dragon buff, but considering he essentially acquires the collector item passive for free, along with at least like 5% max out true damage over 3 seconds that continuously increases, pretty much any good enemy team will be constantly monitoring when Smolder reaches that power spike. Like most infinite scalers, the goal is to shut him down before they reach that point, but Smolder isn't just an infinite scaler, he's also an evolver. His attack range and threat capability increase along with his damage output, making him exponentially stronger compared to a Veigar or Sion who only scale linearly, or a Kayle and Victor who scale in bursts. And this is specifically why his ability to go top or mid is a massive problem. Smolder gets stronger just by playing the game. Dragon Practice accumulates stacks whenever he last hits a minion with his Q or any of his abilities damage enemy champions, meaning getting to that power spike is not a matter of if, but when. I'm aware Veigar has the same thing where if he keeps tagging with abilities he also gains AP, but Smolder is also an evolver, he doesn't just gain more damage but more options too. Not that Smolder really counters anyone in particular, but depending on the matchup it can be easier or harder for him to stack up. Down in bot lane, even if he's against an opponent who's not too big of a threat like Ezreal, the laning phase can still be rough depending on who the enemy's support is, allowing you to still keep Smolder in check even if you don't have the most aggressive bot laner. No such worry exists in solo lane. If Smolder gets to lane against a champion without an easy way to get on top of them such as Cassante, Olawi, Ornn, etc., Smolder basically gets to stack for free. Even if you as the top laner play it cool and minimize your deaths, keep even in CS, you're still losing against Smolder because he wins in neutral by getting stacks and Qs and Ws on you. You don't have a support who can engage the Smolder and set you up, so if the jungler doesn't camp the Smolder, he gets a free ticket to 225 stacks and an easy late game sweep. Mid lane might prove to be a bit more hazardous for him given assassins can easily jump on Smolder and most mages have the same attack range as him, but there's also merit to playing him there as well. With a shorter lane, he can fly back to his tower very quickly if anything goes wrong, and at 25 stacks, Smolder's wave clear becomes decent enough to where he can roughly match other mages, mitigating the chance of him being pushed under tower. At 125 stacks, he has practically the same wave clear as Nivea or Victor. Secondly, Smolder is a decently strong neutral game. His W is a long range, wide covering bubble good for wave clearing and slowing enemies down. W combined with his unique movement ability in the form of his E makes it so enemies have to blindside him if they want to get in range. Otherwise, he can slow everyone down, then fly away. Considering Smolder habitually plays from a far distance in lane, it's hard for mages to really attack him without it being painfully obvious. If Malzahar, Anivia, Annie, Vladimir, whoever starts beelining towards him, he can sneeze on them then fly away. The only ones who can really pose a threat to him are those who can engage on him really fast and then keep engaging on him. Irelia, Diana, Zed, Yasuo, LeBlanc, those types of champions, but like I mentioned before, Smolder gains power even just by attacking you, and with most hard engaged champs being melee, Smolder can still make progress to his end goal, although he's still at a disadvantage. But therein lies the point, if Smolder gets to counterpick the enemy top or mid, it might be flat out impossible for them to stop him from stacking up, bypassing the most critical window of opportunity the enemy team has to shut him down. At present, Smolder's kit is constructed in such a way that not only is it almost too easy for him to reach endgame mode, but said endgame mode is also too impactful courtesy of being both an infinite scaler and an evolver. Comparing him to others, Kayle's issue is that she gets stronger in stages, picture a staircase. She takes a big leap in power but then doesn't really improve much until the next leap in power. being invariably useless pre-6 is a lot bigger of a handicap than Smolder's inability to wave clear. Moreover, her true power spike at level 16 is indeed a force to be reckoned with, but typically champs don't start reaching level 16 until around the late 20s mark. That's assuming you're not behind in XP, which Kayle usually is if her lane opponent bullies her correctly. It's not like she gains XP by auto-attacking her opponent. Smolder on the other hand reaches 225 stacks around the early 20-minute mark, by the time he's about, I would say, level 14. It's not that much faster, but a lot can happen in 25 minutes. Smolder's 225 stack skew versus Kayle's increased attack range and perma exaltation are roughly the same in terms of how threatening they become, but the advantage is that Smolder has a way to reach that point without killing or even CSing. Another evolver would be Victor. Victor needs to last in minions and score takedowns to acquire hex fragments. Denying him farm and keeping him 0 kill participation can make the difference between a fully upgraded Victor by like 15 minutes and a fully upgraded Victor by 25 minutes. That makes a significant difference if you think about it. Less shield and no movement speed on Q, no slows on his attacks, no wave clear, stuff like that. Granted, Victor's evolutions are not game warping, but they do matter. Smolder on the other hand can have 10 deaths, but he can still be well on his way to 225 if he's constantly fighting. It's the same experience as Kayn essentially. Some Kayn players intend feed early game just to get their form faster so they can really start doing stuff. Comparing him against infinite scalers, I mentioned how stat-based infinite scaling has diminishing returns after a certain point. Is a 10,000 AP Veigar scarier than a 1000 AP Veigar? Absolutely, but his short range, susceptibility to hard engage, and whatnot don't change. Nasus can have a billion stacks for all the difference it makes to his issue with getting kited and being single target. Smolder's infinite scaling resolves multiple things that make him weak. Early on, his wave clear kinda sucks. Later on, he becomes one of the best wave clear ADCs in the game. Early on, Smolder has a hard time dealing with super tanks who can body block all his shots. No problem, the splash damage can actually punish the enemy team for putting a tank between him and his target. Smolder simultaneously gets stronger and gets ways to actually put that strength to use more comfortably. One more thing about Smolder, his evolutions come with base value. Kayle's increased attack range and AoE damage don't really matter if she has no items. Likewise for Victor or Kha'Zix, they can be level 18, but if they're 2 items behind everyone else, you couldn't care less about them. Smolder, however, can be behind and still be scary because the stacks themselves represent power. He does bonus magic damage based on stacks. Each upgrade of his Q makes it easier to then get more stacks, and at 225 the execute threshold threatens enemies by existing. He could have no items and still pose a threat. All Smolder has to do is tag them with a Q, which becomes extremely easy given the massive AoE and splash, and all of a sudden everyone has to worry about taking subsequent damage, whether from Smolder or someone else. Now conceptually speaking, I meant what I said. I don't think Smolder having a mini Elder Dragon buff is necessarily a bad thing. Would it be less problematic if it was magic damage instead of true, or if it never had an execute? Of course, but credit where it's due, Smolder has Counterplay. He still gets murderized by hard engage, and anyone with long range fire like Xerath or Vel'Koz can easily make work of him. You might also recall in my YeastBeast video I talked about how they forfeit team comp coverage for a safer or more advantageous laning phase. Those all remain the same, but I think what makes Smolder feel obnoxious to deal with, especially in solo lanes, is that it's too easy for him to reach a late game power spike where he's too impactful. There aren't that many non-FF15 games where Smolder doesn't reach 225 stacks, regardless of whether the team with Smolder won or lost, and I'm willing to bet money Riot's aware of this too. Since being released, they mostly went after the base impact of his kit. Super Scorcher Breath lost base missiles but added more missiles per 100 stacks. His Q went from a base max out true damage burn to scaling true damage. The number of attacks on his E went from crit chance to dragon practice, and they also placed a hard cap on the execute threshold so the super late game it didn't go to like 10% current health. Basically, they made it so Smolder couldn't just auto 1v9 the game at 225. It's still a critical breakpoint mind you, but with the true damage burn being dependent on if he's doing well in terms of items and also emphasizing the importance of maintaining good stacks even after 225, they've attempted to both pull back on Smolder's base value while also reducing how impactful he is once he gets to that point. To wrap everything up, Smolder is essentially the perfect example of what happens when you try to make a caster marksman who can also scale infinitely. Most ability casters fall off in relation to auto attackers due to their ceiling being lower. Smolder is a caster marksman with infinite scaling, meaning he has no ceiling, yet at the same time he's also fairly safe and more lenient than other infinite scalers. On top of that, he has the privilege of build diversity, being half marksman, half mage essentially. If he wants to, he can go Triforce Muramana Fire Cannon for long range pokes, or he can go Essence Reaver Shojin, etc. Then there's also the fact that he's easy to pick up and play, mechanically speaking, which is why everyone and their mothers have been trying to play him. For clarity, I'm not saying Smolder is the most egregious marksman out there. I just think that conceptually, Riot may have been a bit too lax on how easy it is for him to scale. It's gotten to a point where Smolder has to effectively get gutted to stay healthy, quote unquote. They need to flatten the curve, but I might be in the minority. What do you guys think about Smolder? feel free to share it in the comments down below. For now, if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other Everything Wrong With episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.